The 60s brought with it many historical events. In 1961, the country was on edge because of the Cuban crisis. And being so close to Cuba, the church held a prayer dinner on the night prior to the invasion. In the same year, in a private service, the urn containing Reverend Ralph's ashes was buried on the church property. And there's a small plaque on this west wall, just on the other side of the Christ window, where those remains are buried. As the 60s progressed, President John Kennedy visited Tampa. It would be 4 days later that he would be assassinated. Just as the nation experienced a time of uncertainty, so did Church by the Sea. They were without a full-time minister. And so it was decided to sell the old parsonage and purchase a newer home to be able to attract a younger minister, perhaps with a family as a candidate. The church purchased a home on a water channel with a dock and a seawall. Now, here are the perks of that time. It had a refrigerator. Okay, that was like a bonus, right? Air conditioning, and they made the landscaping real nice, all for $19,000. So a new pastor was hired at Church by the Sea in 1961, who's a huge part of our legacy here, John E. Pickens, Jr. A 38-year-old pastor accepted the call for the ministry with a salary of $400 a month plus car allowance. He would be the pastor for 30 years here at Church by the Sea. Madeira Beach had a volunteer fire department to assist the fire chief. Many in the community, including the minister of the church, would leave their jobs and homes when the city siren would blare, and they would jump in their cars with their CB radios and go to the location of the fire. So Dr. Iskra and I need to dust off our old firefighter gear and get out there. Our country was involved in the Vietnam War. Many of the young men in the community and in the church were drafted or enlisted in the armed forces, and we lost several youth from the city of Madeira Beach. At that time, the church purchased a house on Gulf Boulevard and allowed the youth to call it their own. It was named The Shack, and it served as a coffee house and a meeting place for the youth of the city to meet, to talk through the grief of those who passed in Vietnam, and to talk about their faith. The original Welch Causeway Bridge was actually built in 1925, and it was a narrow two-lane bridge. It was so narrow that when the school bus crossed over the bridge, taking kids to school, moms would stop all other traffic so that the bus could take over the whole bridge, because it was just that narrow. They were kind of concerned about safety. And so it was around this time here in the 60s that they were like, you know what, we need to rebuild this thing. We need to make it a little bit safer. And so they redid the bridge to be wider, to be better constructed. And finally, people from the mainland really felt safe crossing the bridge and going to the beaches. At the same time, the Sea Towers was built just over the bridge, and it brought more members to our church at the time. This also opened up a way for people from the Seminole area to get to the beaches, and our church gained members during that time as well, mainly because of that new bridge. And tourists could also travel now to places like John's Pass Boardwalk that had a marine center at the time featuring Patty the porpoise. And there's actually a billboard of that. I'm assuming he's a real porpoise. May he rest in peace. The coldest weather in years, the freeze of 1962, hit Florida by surprise. The church fellowship hall was opened up for people to keep warm, as many homes on the beaches didn't have heating, and the cold shelter system that rolls out when we have cold weather here, it wasn't fully realized yet. The infrastructure just wasn't there. And so for many years, this became a cold weather shelter for the community, with church volunteers cooking soup, providing blankets, and a place to keep warm when the temperatures dropped. And we believe this may have been the early stages of the food pantry that we now have that operates during the week. In 1965, a cruise ship, the Yarmouth Castle, burned and sank off the Bahamas with the loss of 89 lives. One of the church members had taken her only child and his friend, both 14, on the cruise. Mrs. Hamilton survived, but both boys did not. Dr. Pickens went to the Bahamas to help with the families of those who died on the ship with practical needs and grief counseling. A scholarship fund was started in memory of the two boys. The Women's Fellowship adopted a student from Seoul, Korea from 1968 to 1972, and they developed a really cool relationship, so much so that when she was done with school and when we were done with that process, she later visited the church to thank the women for their support. The church celebrated its silver anniversary of the founding of the church. 25 years earlier, from a membership of 54, there are now 900 members and a Sunday school of 200. 2 services are held and 4 on Easter Sunday. The beaches now have over 23,000 year-round residents. You know, seeing Dr. Pickens' commitment in his early time as pastor here in the 60s to being integrated into the community, talking about the volunteer fire department, you're talking about looking at what's going on in the world and being a real part of it. I think it reminds me of Proverbs 3:27, which says, whenever you are able, do good to people who need help. It's that simple. Proverbs 3:27 says, whenever you are able, do good to people who need help. There are recent examples of how we try to live into this legacy today. I think of the Pearls ladies pooling their resources last year to meet urgent needs for our native missionary in Uganda, Molly. I think of making sure Lenora, who's also in Uganda, another one of our missionaries, had a safe vehicle for conducting her ministry, and we took up an offering for that. I think of sending over $10,000 from just one Sunday's benevolence offering to a Fort Myers church that was decimated by Ian. I think of the larger benevolence cases that have helped countless single parents. I think of 2 conversations I heard just this week. One was a formerly homeless woman who was getting back on her feet. She had a roof over her head, and a lot of things were looking up for her. She had come by to say thanks for a hoodie she had received. Before she could get on her feet, she had to spend a few nights on the streets. And the warmth that hoodie provided and the food that we gave her, she said, saved her life and allowed her to make it through to where she is now. Another fisherman stopped by, and he was so polite and so grateful, and he mentioned occasionally that the hauls aren't good when the fishermen go out. And when that happens, he has turned to us over the years for food, and we help him through those bad catches. These are examples of what it means to be integrated into the community, which is really what Dr. Pickens spearheaded guiding this church into in the decade of the 60s. And I want to be clear about something. When we think we've arrived at a church, I'm giving examples, but we have to continue this legacy. The Bible says, therefore, if you think you are standing securely, take care that you do not fall. That's from 1 Corinthians 10:12. It's an upstream battle to be intentionally responsive to needs. And we need to be reminded not to become complacent, to do what the proverb says, to whenever we are able, do good to people who need help. To me, the 60s are a call to celebrate the ways that we're living into Dr. Pickens and the church body of the time's legacy, but also a reminder to never lose sight of the fact that that's who we're still called to be today. And we must be intentional to heed God's call to be a fixture of grace and love on these beaches. So we have a lot to learn from those who came before us in terms of living into Proverbs 3:27 and continuing to be that light here at Church by the Sea. So that's the 60s. Look for the 70s next week.